This story is a fictionalized, dramatized reflection, with names and details altered to explore family dynamics rather than accuse real people.
I was standing in a living room that wasn't mine, holding a glass I hadn't finished, listening to a story I already knew too well, and the strange thing was not that everyone laughed, but that I didn't feel the familiar urge to laugh with them or explain myself away. Someone I barely knew was retelling a moment from my past as if it were harmless entertainment, trimming it into a neat punchline. And across the room, I caught my sister's smile, practiced and confident, the same smile she used whenever my missteps made the evening lighter for everyone else. The laughter landed softly, polite and brief, and I felt a quiet jolt of shock, not because the story was cruel, but because I suddenly realized how often this scene had replayed itself under different ceilings, at different tables, with my parents nearby, ready to smooth things over. In my family, my sister was the storyteller, the one people leaned toward, while my past was the material, something safe to borrow because it belonged to me. I had been told for years that this was normal, that families tease, that I should relax, that I was too serious. And standing there, I noticed the second shock arriving right behind the first, the unsettling thought that maybe the truth wasn't hidden at all. It was just carefully wrapped in laughter. I remembered countless dinners where a familiar story surfaced, followed by my parents' calm voices urging me not to make it awkward, not to disrupt the mood, as if my discomfort were the real problem. What shifted in that moment was small and internal, but unmistakable. A quiet doubt about my own role, about why the same pattern felt inevitable and why I had always been the one expected to absorb it. I looked around the room and wondered when humor had started doubling as cover, when affection had begun to require my silence, and whether the version of peace I was protecting had ever included me at all. The shock deepened into suspicion as I recognized that nothing dramatic had changed except my willingness to participate. And that realization carried an unexpected weight. For the first time, I sensed that something true was pressing upward, not as an accusation or a scene, but as a boundary I had never named. And beneath the uncertainty, there was a faint, unfamiliar feeling that hinted at justice without revenge, a future shaped less by winning and more by choosing what I would no longer offer. It was the first time I suspected that healing might begin not with confrontation, but with restraint, with the simple act of noticing where laughter ends, and self-respect quietly starts, and understanding that peace does not always arrive loudly, but sometimes appears as a pause you finally choose to keep for yourself alone, at last, now. I did not grow up believing my family was cruel, only that I was somehow different. And for a long time, that difference felt like something I should apologize for rather than question. My sister Victoria had always been the easy one, the person who could talk to anyone, who remembered stories at the right moment, who knew how to make people feel comfortable, and I admired her for that long before I understood what it cost me. When we were younger, her confidence was framed as charm, and my hesitation was framed as sensitivity, and the labels stuck so early that none of us thought to examine them. At family gatherings, Victoria naturally became the narrator, the one who set the tone, while I became the example, the story pulled from storage whenever the room needed a laugh or a shared memory. The stories were never fabricated, which made them harder to object to, because each one carried a kernel of truth, a missed cue, a bad decision, an awkward moment from my past that had already been survived. People smiled because the stories were familiar, and I smiled too because that seemed to be what kindness required of me. My parents watched these exchanges with what they called relief, grateful that everyone was getting along, and when I stiffened or went quiet, they would step in gently, reminding me that my sister meant well and that families tease. I was told, often and without malice, that I took things too personally, that I should relax, that Victoria was just keeping things light. At first, I believed them because it felt generous to assume good intentions, and because it was easier to accept my own discomfort as a flaw than to consider that something unbalanced was happening in plain sight. Over time, though, sympathy began to curdle into something heavier, a sense that the kindness I was extending was not being returned in kind. I noticed how carefully the stories were chosen, how they always tilted in one direction, how my sister's successes were shared as updates while my mistakes were preserved as anecdotes. I noticed how my parents never asked if I wanted these stories told, only whether I was willing to let them pass. The injustice was subtle, almost polite, but it was consistent, and consistency has a way of teaching lessons whether we intend it to or not. I learned that my role was to absorb, to be agreeable, to prioritize the comfort of the room over my own. And that lesson followed me quietly into adulthood. Each time I was asked to relax. The request was framed as concern, but the effect was to keep me in place, useful and compliant. I was not being attacked, which made it difficult to name what was wrong. Yet I was being used in a way that slowly erased my agency. Sympathy had taught me to excuse the pattern, but injustice began to teach me to see it. And that recognition marked the moment when the family role I had been given stopped feeling like love and started feeling like an obligation I had never agreed to carry. I began to notice how the word relax followed me like a quiet instruction manual, appearing whenever my presence threatened to change the tone of a room. It sounded caring on the surface, almost affectionate. Yet it always arrived at the same moment, just as I hesitated, just as I considered saying something honest. Relax was never about my comfort. It was about continuity, about keeping things moving smoothly so no one else had to feel uneasy. When I replay those moments now, I can see myself nodding, smiling, adjusting my posture, and making myself smaller in ways that felt reasonable at the time. I told myself that peace was worth a little self-editing, that maturity meant choosing harmony over truth, and for a while that explanation held, but doubt has a way of accumulating quietly, and mine began with small questions I could not unask. Why was it always my reaction that needed correcting? Why did humor only flow in one direction? Why did my sister's confidence require my silence to function? Each relaxation chipped away at the story I had been telling myself, replacing it with a suspicion that what I called harmony might actually be compliance. I began to anticipate the moments before they happened, the pause before a story, the glance toward me to gauge whether I would play along. I learned to laugh first, to narrate my own past before anyone else could, believing that control might soften the impact. Instead, it taught everyone that my boundaries were negotiable, that my discomfort was flexible, that I would manage myself so no one else had to. The realization that followed was not explosive. but it was final. I understood that relax did not mean calm down. It meant do not interrupt the version of the family that works for us. That shift in meaning carried a quiet grief, because it reframed years of interactions as transactions rather than care. I saw how my parents' requests were less about me and more about preserving a familiar order. One where my sister's ease set the rhythm and my adaptability filled the gaps. The doubt hardened into disillusionment as I accepted that this pattern was not temporary or accidental, but structural. I had not failed to explain myself well enough. I had been explaining into a system that depended on my restraint. The disillusionment moment came with an unexpected calm, a steady awareness that I was not overly sensitive or mistaken, but positioned. I had been assigned the role of absorber, the one who smooths over rough edges so others can remain comfortable. Seeing that clearly did not make me angry. It made me quiet, because clarity often does. It marked the end of my belief that patience alone would change anything, and the beginning of a harder understanding that justice sometimes starts as the simple refusal to keep participating in a story that was never written with your dignity in mind. That understanding did not bring relief yet, only a deeper suspicion that something essential had been misnamed for years, and that accepting the role I was given had slowly trained me to mistake endurance for virtue and silence for love, until doubt finally refused to stay quiet any longer inside me at all times, anywhere else. Playing along had costs that never showed up in a single argument or a dramatic moment, but accumulated quietly in the background of my life. I began to dread ordinary events that were supposed to feel neutral: invitations to dinner, holidays circled on calendars, casual phone calls that started with warmth and ended with a familiar tightness in my chest. Before each gathering, I rehearsed versions of myself that would cause the least friction, choosing stories that were safe, opinions that were mild, and laughter that arrived on cue. I told myself this was consideration, that adults compromise, that peace requires flexibility, yet my body responded as if it knew the difference. I slept poorly before visits, woke early with my mind already scanning for exits, and felt a persistent fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to fix. The injustice of the arrangement revealed itself not through cruelty, but through expectation. The unspoken rule that my comfort was optional, while everyone else's ease was essential. I noticed how my sister arrived relaxed and left energized, while I arrived braced and left depleted, carrying the invisible labor of smoothing over moments that were never mine to create. The quiet cost was also social, shaping how I related to others outside my family. I learned to anticipate jokes at my expense before they were spoken, to preemptively explain myself, to minimize my history so it could not be borrowed without permission. These habits followed me into workrooms and friendships, where I sometimes mistook restraint for professionalism and silence for maturity. Resistance did not announce itself as defiance, but as hesitation. A pause where compliance used to be automatic. I started declining certain invitations without elaborate excuses, shortening visits, choosing seats at the edges of rooms. I answered calls later than I used to, not out of spite, but because I needed space to hear my own thoughts before absorbing anyone else's. This was not rebellion in any visible sense, yet it marked the beginning of an internal shift, a refusal to keep paying a cost that was never acknowledged. The more I noticed the toll, the harder it became to justify it as love. Playing along no longer felt generous, it felt compulsory, and that realization carried a quiet resolve. I did not confront anyone or demand change, but I began to withdraw my automatic agreement, testing what would happen if I stopped managing everyone else's comfort. The reaction was subtle. Moments of confusion, slight disappointments, a sense that something familiar was missing. And in those gaps, I recognized the shape of my own resistance. It was understated, cautious, and incomplete. But it was mine, and it signaled the end of my willingness to keep absorbing an injustice simply because it arrived politely and had been practiced for years without question. That quiet resistance did not yet feel brave, only necessary, a way of preserving a small core of dignity without asking anyone else to change. And in that restraint, I sensed the first stirrings of a different future, one where healing would require patience rather than performance, and where justice might arrive slowly, carried not by confrontation, but by the steady choice to stop volunteering myself for harm. Even when it wore the familiar mask of family love and tradition, the question came from someone who had no stake in our family history, which is why it landed with such force. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when conversation softens, and my sister had just finished retelling one of her familiar stories, trimmed and polished for a small audience. People smiled, nodded, moved on, and I assumed the moment would dissolve the way it always did. Instead, as we stepped aside to refill our glasses, a co-worker of mine, someone who had known me only in adulthood, asked quietly why my past always seemed to belong to everyone else. The shock was immediate and disorienting, not because the question was rude, but because it was simple. No one had ever framed it that way before. I felt my mind search for the usual explanations. Family humor, harmless teasing, shared memories, and found that none of them fit the question as asked. I gave a non-answer, something polite and vague, but the moment lingered, following me long after the conversation ended. On the drive home, the question replayed itself, stripping away the justifications I had relied on for years. Why was it always my history that became a performance? Why did I accept it as inevitable? Why did the people who loved me never ask if I was comfortable? The clarity did not arrive as a dramatic revelation, but as a steady alignment of facts that had always been visible, just never arranged this way. I understood that the discomfort I felt was not oversensitivity, but recognition. The shock softened into focus as I realized that an outsider had named what insiders had normalized. That single question reframed countless interactions, revealing a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as a coincidence. I saw how often I had been positioned as a resource rather than a person, a source of material that kept gatherings lively while my own interior life remained unexamined. The clarity was unsettling because it offered no immediate solution, only awareness. I could not unhear the question, and I could not answer it honestly without changing something fundamental about how I participated. For the first time, the idea of justice entered my thoughts not as confrontation, but as accuracy, a willingness to call things what they were without exaggeration or blame. The question did not demand action, but it demanded honesty. And that demand shifted my sense of responsibility away from protecting the mood and toward protecting my dignity. In that quiet clarity, I sensed that whatever came next would not be loud or dramatic, but it would be irreversible. Because once a truth is seen clearly, continuing as before becomes a choice rather than a habit. That understanding settled slowly, like light changing in a room, making familiar shapes newly visible. And it left me aware that seeing clearly did not obligate me to explain myself yet, only to recognize that the question had already changed me in ways I could not immediately name then. The moment when things finally shifted did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but during a familiar gathering that felt almost intentionally ordinary. It was my father's birthday, held in my parents' living room in Madison, a space arranged for comfort rather than confrontation, with neighbors. A few relatives and friends from different parts of our lives filling the room. The atmosphere was relaxed, careful, the kind of setting where everyone knows the unspoken rules. Partway through the evening, as plates were cleared and conversation loosened, my sister began one of her usual stories, one I recognized immediately. A past mistake of mine reshaped into something amusing and harmless for the group. The laughter came as expected, warm and brief, and for a moment, nothing appeared different on the surface. What changed was internal. A steadiness I had not felt before, and when the room settled, I spoke without urgency or accusation. I said that I knew these stories often brought laughs, but that I was no longer comfortable having my past told that way. I did not ask for agreement or an apology, and I did not explain myself further. The words were simple, measured, and once spoken, they hung quietly in the air. No one argued. No one defended the story. A few people shifted their weight, someone cleared a throat, and the conversation moved on, slightly altered but intact. That was the public exposure, not a spectacle, but a truth placed gently into a shared space where it could not be unheard. The significance of the moment lay not in anyone's reaction, but in the fact that the pattern had been named in front of witnesses, without blame or performance. I felt a subtle sense of relief, mixed with uncertainty, aware that something irreversible had occurred. Later that evening, as people said their goodbyes, there were polite smiles and careful tones, small signs that everyone had registered the shift, even if no one commented on it directly. In the quiet that followed, reflection set in. I realized that speaking had not fixed anything in the way I once imagined confrontation might, but it had clarified the landscape. The truth was no longer private discomfort carried alone. It had been acknowledged publicly, even if only briefly, and that acknowledgement changed the rules. I noticed how my parents avoided revisiting the moment, how my sister grew quieter, how the evening retained its calm at the cost of something unspoken. This was not humiliation or victory, but exposure in its most restrained form, a boundary stated where silence had once been expected. The reflection that followed was sobering rather than triumphant. I understood that public truth does not force understanding or change, but it does remove the option of pretending nothing was happening. In naming my boundary, I had shifted responsibility away from my endurance and onto the reality of the pattern itself. That realization brought a mix of grief and clarity, because it confirmed that justice, in this context, was not about making anyone wrong, but about making the situation accurate. I left that night aware that the story of my family had not been rewritten, only interrupted, and that interruption, however modest, marked the beginning of a different relationship with myself, one grounded less in compliance and more in quiet honesty that could now stand in the open without apology. The response came quietly and later, which somehow made it heavier, because the audacity of it lay not in volume but in assumption, in the belief that once I had spoken my boundary, my role should immediately return to normal for the sake of everyone else without asking what it had cost me, or whether silence was still possible thereafter. My sister called a few days after the gathering, her tone controlled and wounded, explaining that I had embarrassed her, that people had noticed, and that family matters were meant to stay light, implying that my restraint had disrupted something fragile she felt responsible to protect for everyone else involved, without considering my position at all or my limits anymore. Not long after, my parents followed with their own version, gentler but no less clear, asking why I could not let it go, why I needed to make things uncomfortable, and reminding me that keeping the peace had always been part of my role, in ways they trusted me to manage without complaint or discussion as before, without pause again. The audacity was not that they disagreed with me, but that they assumed my boundary was negotiable, temporary, something I would reconsider once the moment passed, and that my job was still to absorb the discomfort created by naming it for the benefit of everyone involved, so routines could remain unchanged and familiar roles intact as before, without question again. My refusal was simple and unadorned, because I no longer believed explanation would help, and I said only that I was not willing to continue that way, understanding, even as I spoke, that clarity would carry consequences I could not control within a family accustomed to my compliance and my reliable flexibility in moments like this, without resistance before now. The aftermath arrived quietly, as distance rather than drama. Missed calls, shorter conversations, a careful politeness that replaced ease, and a sense that I had altered the emotional climate without offering a replacement version they could accept or understand, without revisiting the boundary itself that had shifted our familiar balance in subtle but lasting ways across our relationships from then. I felt the weight of those consequences not as punishment, but as evidence that my previous silence had been functional for others, and that removing it exposed how much effort I had been contributing without recognition to maintain an atmosphere they valued, while my own needs remained secondary and largely unexamined within the family system that shaped us for years. This was the cost of refusal, not dramatic exile, but a cooling of expectations. And in that cooling, I recognized the truth of my choice, that justice sometimes looks like accepting discomfort rather than demanding immediate resolution from people invested in the old order and the roles it preserved at my expense, for the sake of ease and familiarity alone. I did not argue or justify myself further, because the consequences were already unfolding, and my task was simply to endure them without retreating, trusting that dignity could survive even when approval did not follow me into this new space where boundaries mattered more than harmony, and silence no longer served as proof of love or loyalty to anyone else. The audacity return had passed, leaving behind a quieter landscape shaped by consequence rather than confrontation, and I understood that this, too, was part of healing, the necessary aftermath of choosing truth over ease without the promise of immediate comfort from those accustomed to my silence and my predictable restraint within our shared history as family expectations shifted slowly outward. The consequences of my refusal unfolded slowly, without spectacle, and that slowness made them harder to misinterpret. There was no dramatic fallout, no confrontation that could be replayed or defended, only a gradual thinning of contact that revealed how much effort had once been flowing in a single direction. Calls came less often, conversations stayed on the surface, and visits were discussed vaguely, as if everyone were waiting to see whether I would step back into my old role without being asked. At first, I felt a familiar pull to repair the distance, to smooth things over by minimizing what I had said, but I resisted it, recognizing that this urge was itself part of the pattern I had finally interrupted. The absence of retaliation was intentional because revenge would have kept me tethered to the same dynamic, reacting rather than choosing, measuring my worth against someone else's discomfort. Instead, the consequence was a simple reality. My family adjusted around the boundary rather than through it, and that adjustment exposed where my silence had once been doing so much invisible work. I noticed how gatherings felt quieter, how stories moved on more quickly without my past to fill the space, and how my sister's ease faltered slightly without a reliable contrast to highlight it. These changes were not punishments, but natural outcomes, and seeing them helped me understand that justice does not always arrive as a verdict, but sometimes as a recalibration of effort. Reflection followed closely behind, bringing with it an uncomfortable honesty about my own participation. I had believed I was choosing kindness, yet I saw now how often I had been choosing avoidance, trading short-term peace for long-term self-erosion. The reflection was not cruel, but precise, allowing me to see how my compliance had trained others to expect access without consent. As weeks passed, I felt both loss and relief, mourning the version of closeness that depended on my endurance, while appreciating the quiet that replaced it, without the need to anticipate jokes or manage reactions. My attention turned inward, toward the parts of myself that had been neglected in the service of keeping things light. I began to notice how much energy returned when I stopped bracing for impact, how my thoughts settled when I was not rehearsing explanations or excuses. The absence of revenge created space for something steadier, an understanding that consequences do not require anger to be effective. My family was not punished, but the system we had operated within was changed, and that change carried its own weight. I reflected on how justice, in this sense, was not about evening a score, but about withdrawing from an arrangement that asked too much without acknowledgement. That realization brought a quieter confidence, one rooted not in triumph, but in alignment. I did not feel victorious, only clearer, aware that living with consequence was preferable to living with constant self-compromise. The reflection settled into acceptance, and with it came the knowledge that healing would depend not on anyone else's recognition, but on my continued willingness to honor the boundary I had set. Even when doing so felt lonely or incomplete at first, over time, this acceptance became steadier, quieter, and sufficient, allowing space for dignity, patience, and the slow beginnings of healing ahead. I learned that stopping did not mean disappearing, cutting ties, or rejecting my family, even when others assumed that silence had always been my contribution. What I stopped was offering my past as entertainment, stopping absorbing discomfort so others could remain comfortable, and stopping mistaking endurance for love. I still showed up, still answered calls, still cared in quiet ways, but I no longer volunteered my history to keep a room light. That distinction mattered because it reframed my choice as preservation rather than punishment. Healing arrived gradually, not as forgiveness granted or received, but as a steadier relationship with myself. I noticed how my body relaxed when I entered familiar spaces without bracing, how conversations felt simpler when I did not manage reactions in advance. Peace did not require agreement, only clarity. My parents adjusted in their own time, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with distance, and I allowed that process without chasing resolution. My sister learned slowly that access was no longer automatic, and I learned that boundaries do not need enforcement when they are lived consistently. Stopping meant choosing accuracy over harmony, dignity over performance, and truth over habit. It meant accepting that love can exist without constant proximity, and that healing can unfold without public reconciliation. Over time, the quiet became something I trusted. I built a life less organized around anticipation and more anchored in presence, where my worth was not measured by how well I absorbed discomfort. The story did not end with applause or closure, but with a steadiness that felt earned. In that steadiness, I found a calm that was neither dramatic nor final, only sufficient. And I understood that peace, once chosen, does not announce itself. It simply remains. In that remaining space, I learned to sit with silence without interpreting it as failure, to allow distance without assigning blame, and to recognize that peace can coexist with incompleteness. I stopped waiting for validation to arrive from the same places that had benefited from my self-erasure, and that decision freed attention for work. Friendships and moments that did not require me to perform. There were days when the absence felt heavy, when I missed the ease of belonging without question, but I did not mistake familiarity for health again. What emerged instead was a gentler confidence, one rooted in knowing my limits and honoring them without announcement. This was not an ending, but a settling, a life reoriented around truth rather than tolerance, where justice looked like self-respect, sustained over time, and healing felt less like arrival and more like continuity, steady and quiet, carrying me forward without urgency, without spectacle, without the need to be seen.